Hi, this is Amos with the beginning of my CanJam Singapore coverage for this year, and it starts with the very surprising Campfire Audio Chimera IEMs, which are $7,500, the most expensive flagship that Campfire Audio has ever produced. I was lucky enough to be able to listen to the same review unit that Warren Chi just posted a review of on HeadFi, and I had a couple of hours with which to listen. And in that time I managed to form some impressions, though do note that ideally I would have them for some time longer to get a better idea of how they perform. And if you're thinking, can Campfire Audio and Ken Ball produce a $7,500 quality IEM? They most definitely can. And I totally agree with Warren's evaluation where I think they are an absolutely outstanding pair of IEMs. But let me get into some of the details and some of the notes I took about them.
I'd like to thank Campfire Audio and Bloom Audio for sponsoring my channel. Andrew and his team at Bloom Audio have an astounding range of gear from the inexpensive all the way up to the exotic, including the Campfire Audio range of IEMs, and they aim to have the most outstanding customer service in the industry.
Now I have a list of CanJam tracks which I have, which are very high quality recordings from places such as Native DSD. One of them is Carmen Gomez, and her track I really like called Fool for You. Now this is in DSD 256, a native recording, and I played it back through chords Hugo 2 from my iPad, and this is close to the first time I feel like I'm actually listening to the music more so than I'm listening to the tuning of the IEMs. And this made it very hard to actually switch tracks mid-track, as I wanted to finish every single track before I continued on. And this is the experience I have in my home listening system, where I don't like having tracks interrupted. It's easier with a lot of, say, less capable or less expensive in-ear monitors in many cases, especially lower end ones, where I can get enough of an idea of a track, then switch to the next one and get an idea of the tuning or the capabilities or what have you. But when you get to really excellent and outstanding gear, that's when you don't want to switch tracks, and this was the case here. There's a very coherent transition from the bass through to the treble with the Chimera. Now it is not a completely neutral sound. There are some maybe uneven parts in there, but it's more in the sense like what I experienced with my Focal Utopia headphones, the 2022 version, where if I compare it to something like Dan Clark Audio's E3s, for example, which have a very close to a Harman target curve tuning, when I switch back to something like the Utopias, maybe there's a little bit of unevenness in there, but it brings out the qualities of the music when it does so. The bass quality is fantastic, and interestingly, switching from the Carmen Gomez to Dead Can Dance, a completely different type of music, I felt that I could get that transition without feeling like, oh, I need a different pair of IEMs or I need some EQ or something like that. The Dead Can Dance is actually mastered fairly neutrally, so if there is a strong bass from the drivers in a pair of IEMs or headphones, it works very well with this music. It's not the best recorded music that I have, and if there's any harshness or unpleasantness in the treble in a design of a pair of IEMs or headphones, I will notice that immediately, because then the distortion becomes amplified. In this case, I felt like I could listen to the whole track and wanted to listen to the whole track because of the excellent bass, mid-range and treble, even though I was switching between genres. Now, one of the tracks I use, or one of the albums I use, is from a Japanese jazz pianist, Yoko Mabuchi, and she has a track of Miles Davis music she has played live, which is all DSD 256, and I use that particular album because of the purity of its recording quality and being a live recording with a good sense of space, and also of piano, which, if there's something wrong with the timbre of an IEM's reproduction of the music, then it will become pretty apparent. With this particular track, the timbre of the piano was spot on. The notes of the piano and things like cymbals were all very real. And what is more, I could hear the note decay of individual notes even when the next note was playing, something I haven't yet experienced in in-ear monitors. When there was a single note held for a long time, I could also hear the harmonics as the note transferred its vibrations to adjacent strings. Again, something I have not experienced with a pair of IEMs to date, even using an excellent portable system at recent CanJams consisting of a Hugo 2 and last year an Enlium HBA23RM. I was very impressed also how real cymbals and percussion sounded. It was absolutely phenomenal and something that I usually require my home system to experience. So to experience that in a portable system for me was remarkable, especially with a pair of in-ear monitors. Now, thinking about the soundstage there, it's not a big wide soundstage, no, and it's somewhat more closed in than maybe you can experience with other IEMs, and that's where it reminded me a lot of the Focal Utopias. Maybe not exactly the same tuning, and I'd have to compare directly to be able to decide that, but it has a similar character to it where it's not huge, it's not narrow, but somewhere in between. Now, of course, talking about soundstage with IEMs is kind of challenging because they don't really have a soundstage, but you can get a sense of the width and depth of a particular track to some degree with IEMs, especially if they're extremely well made. And sometimes through some careful tuning and phase alignment, you can get an appreciable soundstage in both width and depth, especially with some of the newer designs. So for that, I wanted to switch to some regular music, but a more modern recording which has been mastered with a lot more bass, which seems to be common nowadays. So John McCleary, who, if you've been watching my channel regularly, I'm a big fan of, his music has a lot more bass in the notes, and it has a degree of purity to the recording where it's not particularly complex and it's not very heavily mastered, which means you can hear details such as the nuances of guitar plucks, which were fantastic through the Chimera. Also, the bass was strong and very punchy, maybe a touch much for my tastes, but in that regard, the ear tips I was using were the JVC Spiral Dot Pros, which tilt the bass in a lot of IEMs maybe a little bit more towards the bass than the treble, which is something I would prefer over having a treble that is too hot. And that was one of the remarkable things about the Chimera. Usually if I don't think about a particular frequency range, that means it's outstandingly perfect and I don't have to think about it. And that was one aspect of the Chimera, primarily the upper mids and treble, which are so good and so precise that I just don't think about them. A lot of IEMs I've tried are either very too hot in the treble, or maybe they have some kind of distortion or something that's not quite right. And to not have to think about that and to be able to listen to the actual instruments and their natural timbre and the nuances of what I'm hearing of the music over listening to the IEMs themselves, that is what I look for in a pair of IEMs. So John McCleary, so there was a strong bass element with those ear tips, and I did try switching to things like the Elitech Baroque Stage and a couple of other ear tips I had on hand, but in the end I switched back to the Spiral Dot Pros, even if that did tilt the bass a little bit too much. Maybe the regular old Spiral Dots might work better, or maybe the Elitech standard Baroque, which I didn't bring with me this time. Be interesting to see how tip rolling goes, as I've noticed that tip rolling has similar kind of effects as it does with other Campfire IEMs, where you can subtly tune things. Now the question is then, why wouldn't you EQ? And with the chord gear I use, if it's not something like a Mojo 2, which has a built-in, well, perceptually lossless EQ, as soon as I engage something like digital volume or digital EQ, it absolutely kills the soundstage and instrument timbre in the music, something I really look out for. So to me, I can't really do that with chord gear unless chord starts building an EQ like the Mojo 2 has into the rest of their gear. If you've ever had the experience where music seems to slow down because the reproduction is not slower, but the sound quality is so good, that was the experience I had with the Chimera, and I've never experienced that with IEMs. I felt like everything was, instead of being shoved in your face, was just engaging because the music and the nuances and the expression of the artists was engaging. One of the things that came up, I was listening to Melody Gardot. In one of her tracks, it has an orchestral introduction. And normally you'd hear the introduction and then you start hearing her voice, and that's when the real engagement starts. But even the orchestra at the beginning was really an emotional and engaging experience before Melody Gardot began singing. Now the bass in that was maybe arguably a touch much for my preferences, which may be a bit more neutral, but I felt that the lack of excess drive energy, something which can interfere with the music, instead allowed the IEMs to disappear in my ears and allow me to feel the expression of the music. Now in those modern tracks like Melody Gardot and John McCleary, I would say for my preferences in that particular setup, the bass energy was a little bit much for what I like. However, the sound quality was at such a high level that essentially the IEMs disappeared and just the music remained. And that's what I've been looking for in a pair of IEMs to date. And that's something that I found even the Bryce Fugaku, and even, I haven't only tried the Hex briefly, but it didn't give me that sense of, oh, well, that's an amazing IEM, but it didn't make me go, oh, just focus purely on the music and not want to stop listening. I think the closest that has come, and this was only an evaluation at a Can Jam, was the Visioneer's Zen, which to date has been my gold standard for IEMs that bring through the music and don't make me think I'm listening to the equipment. So join me for further Can Jam coverage. I'll have something special on Saturday morning and Singapore time, something from an American company of all things that has coming to Can Jam Singapore for the first time, if you know what I'm talking about. So if you haven't already subscribed, make sure you do so and hit the bell button to be notified when I have information on other products from Can Jam Singapore 2026. As always, if you're at the show too, come and say hi, as I'd love to meet everyone. As always, thanks once again for watching, and I look forward to seeing you at the show.